Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I am flying solo once again this week with 8 days to go before the election. I'll be giving you both the Washington Report and the call to action. So, the House and Senate are still both out and will not return until after the election. Now let's talk about an NIH study on puberty blockers that was itself blocked. On Wednesday of last week, the New York Times published a blockbuster story entitled, U.S. Study on Puberty Blockers Goes Unpublished Because of Politics, Doctor Says, end quote. And kudos to the editors of the New York Times, who made what must have been a rather courageous decision to report news despite the likely outcome of that reporting, to wit, that many on the left would become upset at the revelations contained in the news. The story reads like this, quote, an influential doctor and advocate of adolescent gender treatments said she had not published a long-awaited study of puberty-blocking drugs because of the charged American political environment. The doctor, Johanna Olson Kennedy, began the study in 2015 as part of a broader multi-million-dollar federal project on transgender youth. She and colleagues recruited 95 children from across the country and gave them puberty blockers, which stave off the permanent physical changes, like breasts or a deepening voice, that could exacerbate their gender distress, known as dysphoria. The researchers followed the children for 2 years to see if the treatments improved their mental health. An older Dutch study had found that puberty blockers improved well-being, results that inspired clinics around the world to regularly prescribe the medications as part of what is now called gender-affirming care. But the American trial did not find a similar trend, Dr. Olson Kennedy said in a wide-ranging interview. Puberty blockers did not lead to mental health improvements, she said, most likely because the children were already doing well when the study began, end quote. Which, of course, raises the obvious question. If they were in really good shape, why would they need to take puberty blockers in anticipation of gender transition surgery? In fact, as the article makes clear, the doctor's assertion to the reporter that the children were doing well when the study began conflicts with an earlier description of the group in which the doctor and her colleagues, quote, noted that 1/4 of the adolescents were depressed or suicidal before treatment, end quote. Continuing the article, quote, in the 9 years since the study was funded by the National Institutes of Health and as medical care for this small group of adolescents became a searing issue in American politics, Dr. Olson Kennedy's team has not published the data, end quote. Asked why, she said, quote, I do not want our work to be weaponized. It has to be exactly on point, clear and concise, and that takes time, end quote. Republican Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rodgers, chairman of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, said Friday her committee would launch an investigation into the matter. Quote, this is a clear example of the politicization of science at the expense of children, she said. Research funded by taxpayer dollars through the National Institutes of Health should be publicly disclosed regardless of the results, and Americans deserve access to the truth. For a scientist to withhold findings deliberately because the finding doesn't substantiate a preferred outcome further erodes public trust in the NIH and its programs. Our committee will be launching an investigation into the matter, end quote. At last count, it appears the study has received more than $10 million in taxpayer funding. Stay tuned. Now for the latest on anti-Trump lawfare. On Thursday, in federal district court in Washington, D.C., former President Trump's lawyers filed a motion seeking the dismissal of special counsel Jack Smith's 4-count indictment against Trump for election subversion on the grounds that Smith was unconstitutionally appointed. The new filing, submitted to Judge Tanya Chutkan, mimics the argument Trump's lawyers made in Florida to great success. The argument relies on the fact that Smith was not appointed properly because he was not confirmed by the Senate. That defect, according to the filing, requires the court to set aside everything he's done, including the indictment. Smith will respond in writing by October 31. Now for the latest on non-citizen voting. On Friday, Federal District Judge Patricia Giles, appointed to the federal bench by Barack Obama, ruled in favor of Joe Biden's Department of Justice when she ordered the Commonwealth of Virginia to restore more than 1,500 non-citizens to the state's voter rolls that the state had removed in the last several weeks, following the dictates of a 2006 state law requiring non-citizens to be removed from the state's voter rolls. Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin vowed to appeal immediately. Quote, "Let's be clear about what just happened," he said. Only 11 days before a presidential election, a federal judge ordered Virginia to reinstate over 1,500 individuals who self-identified themselves as non-citizens back onto the voter rolls. Almost all of these individuals had previously presented immigration documents confirming their non-citizen status, a fact recently verified by federal authorities. End quote. Stay tuned. Now let's talk about Campaign 2024. There are 8 days left until Election Day, but early voting is going on all over the country. Make a plan to vote, whether in-person early voting, if your state offers that, or by absentee ballot. Please don't wait until Election Day. You don't want to be stuck with an unplanned event of some kind that keeps you from getting to the polls and casting a vote in a timely fashion. This election is simply too important for that. Now, let's do a Senate and House roundup with 8 days to go. On next week's broadcast, the last before Election Day, we're going to take some time to do a deep dive and walk through the battleground states, so you'll know which counties to look at as election returns come in on Tuesday night. On this broadcast, we're going to take just a little bit of time to take a look at what's going on in the Senate and the House. After all, while it's much better to control the White House than to have the other side in control, it doesn't do quite as much good as you might think if you were facing a Congress controlled by the other team. So, winning control of the House and the Senate is just as important as winning the White House. Let's start with the Senate. Right now, Democrats control the Senate by 51 to 49. Democrats are behind the 8-ball this cycle, having to defend 23 seats, while Republicans merely have to defend 11. The 23 seats Democrats are defending include Montana, Ohio, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, all of which are either ruby red, Ohio and Montana, or are presidential battleground states. This is important, because we've seen this phenomenon in recent cycles where you can predict the winner of the state's Senate contest if you know which party's candidate won the state's electoral votes in the presidential contest. In fact, in 2020 and 2022 of the 66 contests for a seat in the Senate, precisely one of them was won by the candidate of the party that had lost the state's electoral votes in the most recent presidential election. That was in Maine in 2022 when Republican Susan Collins held on. So, in the era of increased and increasing polarization, we see a strong connection between a party's electoral fortunes at the presidential level and in the Senate contest. Assume for the sake of argument that Trump sweeps all the battleground states and each of the GOP Senate candidates in those states wins as well. That would flip the Senate from a 51 to 49 Democrat majority to a 57 to 43 Republican majority. That's very unlikely to happen, but it could. Let's start with 51 Democrat-held seats. First up is West Virginia, where Democrat-turned-independent Joe Manchin is retiring and leaving an open seat. The Republican candidate is incumbent Governor Jim Justice, and every handicapper has ceded this race to the Republicans. So now it's a 50-50 Senate. Of all the states and contests I listed a moment ago, 2 are not in presidential battleground states, Montana and Ohio. In Montana, incumbent Democrat John Tester looks like he's in serious trouble against Republican challenger Tim Sheehy. In fact, most handicappers seem to think Sheehy has taken a strong position and is likely to win. In Ohio, incumbent Democrat Sherrod Brown won his first election to the Ohio House of Representatives as a Watergate baby in 1974, 50 years ago. In all the years since then, he's only lost one election. He was elected to the United States Senate in 2006, and he's won in good years and bad since. But it looks like he's in a tight race, and Trump is likely to win Ohio by 8 to 10 points. That may provide Republican challenger Bernie Moreno long enough coattails that he beats Brown and the Republicans flip the seat. Then we move to the real battleground state contests. Of the 7 battleground states in the presidential contest, Democrats are facing toss-up Senate contests in 4 of them. Ohio, which we just talked about, Michigan, which is an open seat, Pennsylvania, where 3-term incumbent Democrat Bob Casey is being challenged by David McCormick, and Wisconsin, where 2-term incumbent Democrat Tammy Baldwin is being challenged by businessman Eric Hovde. Each of these races is coming down to the wire, and each of these races is going to be affected by the outcome of the presidential contest in the state. What's been very interesting to see over the last 2 weeks is the Democrat incumbents deciding to air campaign advertising with a message that they can and have worked with President Trump. You don't do that if you're confident that your own party's presidential nominee is going to carry your state. You do that if you think Trump is going to carry your state. And that means that in order for you to win, you're going to have to peel off some Trump voters, or you'll lose. No Republican candidate for the Senate is airing ads saying they can work with Kamala Harris. So that's a very interesting tell. There's a second reason these Democrats are running advertisements touting their ability to work with Trump. They know that the remaining undecided voters are leaning very heavily towards Trump. According to the Wall Street Journal's most recent polling, in Pennsylvania, 51% of undecided Senate voters say they're planning to vote for Trump, against just 23% who say they support Harris. In Ohio, 78% of voters who are undecided in the Senate contest say they support Trump. In Montana, that number is 59%, and in Arizona, it's 77%. Overall, says the Journal, twice as many undecided voters in Senate races back Mr. Trump over Ms. Harris, end quote. I have no idea how these races are going to turn out. I think it's very likely they're going to be influenced by the presidential contest in each state. I have a hard time thinking that somewhere in Pennsylvania there's a Trump-Casey voter, or that somewhere in Wisconsin there's a Trump-Baldwin voter. But Casey and Baldwin think those people might exist and think there might be enough of them that it's worth spending money to advertise to them. Then there are the races in Arizona and Nevada. In Arizona, which is an open seat, Democrat Ruben Gallego is holding a lead outside the margin of error against 2022 GOP gubernatorial nominee and longtime local anchorwoman Kari Lake. Gallego has had a solid lead in this race for months, and I don't see that changing. Right next door, in Nevada, incumbent Democrat Jackie Rosen is being challenged by Republican Sam Brown. Rosen has had a lead outside the margin of error for most of the contest, but things have tightened in recent weeks, so we're keeping our eye on this one. There's one more Senate race where Democrats are playing defense. Maryland, where incumbent Ben Cardin is retiring and leaving an open seat. The Democrat candidate is Angela Alsobrooks, the county executive in Prince George's County, the second most populated county in the state. In any other year, this would be a sleeper of a race, with no one giving a second thought to the Republican candidate. But this year, the Republican candidate for the Senate is Larry Hogan, who spent 8 years as Maryland's very popular governor. Hogan is the kind of Republican candidate who can win in very blue Maryland. In other words, he's a very liberal Republican. He's made clear he will not be a pro-MAGA, pro-Trump Republican, and because he was so well known and so popular, he took an early lead in the race. The Democrats' campaign took a while to find its sea legs, but it finally did, and Alsobrooks seems to have stabilized with the lead outside the margin of error. Given the pull of the presidential campaign in the state, I expect Kamala Harris will carry the state comfortably. I think it's going to be too much for Hogan to overcome. But just in case it happens, I wanted you to at least have heard about the race. There are 3 more races of interest, and in each Republicans are playing defense. In Florida, Rick Scott is running for re-election to a second term. In Texas, Ted Cruz is running for re-election to a third term. About a month ago, national Democrats said they saw opportunities in both cases and were going to spend serious resources. So far, they haven't done that, and I see no reason to believe there's going to be a lot of split-ticket voting in either Florida or Texas. The third race is in Nebraska, where the Democrats aren't even running a candidate. That's because there's an independent candidate running against Republican Deb Fischer, who ran a rather lackluster campaign for several months and seemed to be almost asleep at the wheel. But in recent weeks, the Fischer campaign and national Republicans have woken up and are now pouring resources into the state to avoid an embarrassing upset. So, if I had to bet, I'd bet that the Republicans will recapture control of the Senate. But as to whether they end up with 51 seats or 55 seats, your guess is as good as mine. Now to the House. The current breakdown is 220 Republicans and 212 Democrats, with 3 open seats. 2 of the open seats were previously held by Democrats and 1 by a Republican. First team to 218 will control the House in January. So Republicans can only afford to lose 3 seats net. If they lose 4, they would drop to minority status. As always, because of gerrymandering, the vast majority of the 435 seats in the House will feature non-competitive races. According to the most venerable of the professional election handicapping services, the Cook Political Report, Republicans will start the cycle with 2 seats virtually guaranteed to go to the Democrats because of mid-decade redistricting. In addition, Republicans will defend 14 seats considered toss-ups, and another 6 seats are considered lean Republican. Democrats, on the other hand, will defend 11 seats that are considered toss-ups and another 11 that are considered lean Democrat. Now let's talk about election integrity. On Friday, authorities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, announced an investigation into fraudulent voter registration applications, 2,500 of them. The forms were dropped off in 2 separate batches at the county's Board of Elections office on Monday before the voter registration deadline at the end of the day. Employees processing the forms noticed several red flags, including duplicate handwriting, signatures that didn't match the signatures on file, and incorrect addresses. Now let's talk about Harris and Trump and what they did over the weekend. Former President Trump spent 3 hours Friday afternoon with Podcast King Joe Rogan, who regularly gets about 15 million downloads and another 17 million YouTube views. By Sunday afternoon, yesterday, 2 days after the podcast, the YouTube video had been viewed 29 million times. Trump's Friday afternoon was followed by Kamala Harris's Friday evening event in Houston, where her campaign had invited tens of thousands of supporters to show up to hear a Beyonce concert. Anyone who showed up to hear Beyonce in concert went home disappointed, because Beyonce was on stage for just a few minutes to offer an endorsement of Harris. When on the video that I saw thousands of people leaving for the exits once Beyonce got off stage. I thought they were Harris supporters. Maybe they weren't Harris supporters. They were just Beyonce fans. Anyway, they were walking out of the arena as Harris spoke to the crowd. Harris, of course, chose to do her event in Houston at 9:30 p.m. East Coast time, right in the middle of the first game of the Yankees-Dodgers World Series. But the biggest event of the weekend, of course, that was Donald Trump's Sunday afternoon rally at Madison Square Garden in Manhattan, an event he's been talking about doing since he first ran for president in 2016. Now to the Jenny Beth Show, episode 92, episode 93, and episode 94 of the Jenny Beth Show all dropped last week. Episode 92, featuring Jenny Beth's interview with Michael Faulkender of the America First Policy Institute, dropped Monday. Episode 93, featuring Jenny Beth's conversation with former Acting Secretary of Homeland Security Chad Wolf, dropped Wednesday. And episode 94, featuring Jenny Beth's discussion with former Congressman Jody Hice, who's now the president of FRC Action, the 501c4 lobbying arm of the Family Research Council, dropped Friday. All 3 episodes are interesting and informative, and all 3 are highly recommended. And that's our Washington report for this week. Now to the call to action. There are just 8 days left until Election Day, and in many states, early voting has already begun. If you have not yet joined our action team, please go to marchtovictory.com to help get out the vote. If you live in Georgia, our affiliated super PAC, Tea Party Patriots Citizens Fund, is paying people to go door to door. Most importantly, especially if you live in a battleground state, please sign up to help increase voter turnout. We'll send you directions on how to download our new app and use that app to reach your family and friends to be sure they get out and vote. You and your efforts could make the difference between victory and defeat in the November elections. As always, if you have a question or a comment, you can email us at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. If you want me to answer a question on air, just add "for broadcast" to the subject line. We'll see you next week. Until then, be well and be active.